One moment I was a young Marine, full of life, hitting the road with my buddy for a much-needed break. The next, time fractured. Reality shifted, and I found myself staring down at a scene that defied all logic, a scene that included me. I'd been told I was in an accident, but how could that be when I was floating above the chaos, feeling no pain, just an unsettling calm? What happened in those lost moments, and how did I end up witnessing my own body being loaded into an ambulance?
I was a young man who thought he knew a thing or two, eager to see the world, but life had a way of hitting you when you least expected it. Before July 1, 1988, my life was pretty straightforward as it gets for a newly minted United States Marine Corps private. I just finished boot camp in April, and the world, or at least my small corner of it, felt wide open. I was a fresh face in a uniform, full of that youthful confidence that comes with feeling like you're finally part of something bigger. My days were a mix of routine drills, physical training, and the occasional downtime, fantasizing about what I'd do on my next leave. I lived in the barracks, surrounded by guys just like me, ambitious, a little rebellious, and always up for an adventure. I wasn't particularly academic, but I was street smart and resilient, qualities that the Corps certainly amplified. Growing up, I was always the kind of kid who preferred being outside, getting my hands dirty, or exploring. I wasn't much for sitting still. My childhood wasn't perfect, but it had its moments of simple joy and important lessons. I remember one summer, probably around 10 years old, I tried to build an elaborate treehouse that was more ambition than engineering. It crashed down, of course, but the sheer joy of creation and the stubborn refusal to give up stuck with me. Then there were the tougher times, like when my grandfather passed. It was my first real encounter with loss, and it left a quiet ache, a subtle understanding that life was precious and fleeting. Those early experiences, both good and bad, molded me into someone who valued resilience and the thrill of pushing boundaries. Emotionally, I was probably typical for my age, a mix of exuberance and underlying restlessness. There was a youthful optimism, a feeling that anything was possible if you just pushed hard enough. But beneath that bravado, I think there was a simmering sense of unease. Not quite boredom, but a feeling that something was missing, a deeper purpose I hadn't yet found. I was constantly seeking the next thrill, the next challenge, the next escape from the mundane. It wasn't a crippling anxiety, more like a background hum, a subtle whisper that there was more to discover, more to feel. When it came to life and death, my views were, well, pretty standard for someone who hadn't truly faced either. I was raised in a Christian household, went to church on holidays, and considered myself a born-again Christian. But it wasn't a deeply practiced faith. It was more of a cultural identity than a personal conviction. Death was something distant, something that happened to other people, usually older ones. I didn't spend much time pondering the afterlife or the nature of existence. I was too busy living, or at least trying to. There was a healthy dose of skepticism in me, too, a tendency to believe what I could see and touch. The idea of a soul or a spirit was theoretical, a Sunday school concept that didn't quite mesh with the gritty reality of marine life. Little did I know, all of that was about to be irrevocably challenged.
One moment I was fighting this overwhelming exhaustion. The next I was being tossed into the back seat, a move that unbeknownst to me was a cosmic intervention, shifting the very trajectory of my fate. July 1st, 1988 started like any other Friday. The air hung heavy with the promise of a long weekend, a 4-day pass that felt like pure gold after the relentless grind of Marine boot camp. My friend, Andy, who was just as eager to escape the confines of base life, had scored the passes. The plan was simple, ambitious even. Drive our 1972 Plymouth Trail Duster all the way to Pittsburgh.
For me, that meant a chance to see my family. A brief return to the familiar before diving back into the structured chaos of military life. We packed light. A couple of duffel bags, and the car, a relic of American muscle, felt like a chariot of freedom. But something was off almost immediately. As we hit the highway, a strange, unshakable wave of exhaustion washed over me. I'd been well rested, no late nights or grueling drills, yet it felt like a heavy blanket had been thrown over my mind. My eyelids grew impossibly heavy, a constant battle against the urge to simply drift off. It wasn't a normal tiredness, it was deeper, more insistent, almost like a sleeping sickness. I kept fighting it, trying to stay present, but my head would loll and I'd lose myself for brief, disorienting moments. Andy, oblivious to my internal struggle, was just buzzing with excitement, happy to be on an adventure, singing along to the radio. I tried to shake it off, blaming the monotonous drone of the highway, but deep down, a quiet alarm bell began to ring. This wasn't right. We finally pulled into my hometown, a welcome sight, and the immediate priority was visiting my cousins. The sleepy fog clinging to me seemed to lift slightly with the change of scenery and the buzz of familiar faces. Everyone, it seemed, had one thing on their mind: off-roading in my car. Despite my persistent weariness, the idea of tearing up some dirt trails had a certain appeal. We decided to fuel up before heading into the mountains. As we pulled into the gas station, the exhaustion hit me with renewed force, and I was out cold the moment we stopped. It was then that Richie, ever the joker, nudged me awake, his voice laced with playful annoyance. "Bitch, if you're gonna sleep, you're getting in back." Before I could even protest, he'd picked me up and unceremoniously dumped me into the back seat, claiming shotgun for himself. It was a small, seemingly insignificant act, born of youthful impatience, but in hindsight, it was a pivot point, a critical twist of fate that would determine everything that followed. I grumbled, settling into the back seat, half asleep, completely unaware that this casual decision had just saved my life. We started our ascent up the winding mountain road, the engine of the trail duster straining slightly. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows, and the air grew cooler. The rhythmic rumble of the tires against the asphalt, combined with my lingering exhaustion, almost lulled me back to sleep. Suddenly, a jolt, a jarring sound. The car lurched, and Richie, from the passenger seat, swore loudly. The master cylinder had disintegrated. In an instant, the light-hearted mood evaporated, replaced by a chilling dread. We had just crested the summit, doing about 30 miles per hour, but now the car began to pick up speed, gathering momentum as it hurtled down the steep grade on the other side. On one side, a sheer rock wall. On the other, enormous pine trees blurred into a green streak. The road was a twisting ribbon of asphalt, unforgiving and narrow. Andy, at the wheel, became a blur of focused intensity, his knuckles white as he wrestled the steering wheel, making impossible turns, trying desperately to shove the stick into reverse, anything to slow us down. The desperate grinding of the gears, the squeal of the tires, the increasing roar of the wind rushing past the windows, it all built into a terrifying symphony of impending disaster. Each turn felt like a near miss, a prayer whispered and answered, only for the car to accelerate even more. 2 miles of this heart-stopping descent felt like an eternity. We had one last sharp turn, one more desperate attempt to make it to a safer, flatter stretch of road. The tension in the car was palpable, a suffocating presence. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a frantic drum signaling the inevitable. We braced ourselves, a silent, desperate plea hanging in the air. But we didn't make the turn. The world exploded in a cacophony of screeching metal, shattering glass and splintering wood as we collided with an enormous pine tree. And then, for a moment, nothing. I remember thinking, that poor man looked so broken, only to realize with a jolt that the mangled form below was in fact my own. It was a clarity that transcended human understanding, a moment of profound, undeniable recognition that shattered every preconceived notion I had about life and about death. The impact was immediate, a deafening symphony of wrenching metal and shattering glass. My world turned violently, a sickening lurch followed by a sudden jarring halt. In the milliseconds after the collision, a bizarre stillness descended. There was no pain, no fear, just an abrupt, profound sense of disorientation. I recall a dim awareness of being on the floor of the vehicle, the scent of pine and gasoline filling the air. Then darkness, not a suffocating blackness, but a gentle fading, like the last embers of a dying fire. My next conscious sensation was one of pure, unburdened weightlessness. It wasn't the feeling of falling, but rather of an effortless ascension, a gentle lifting away. I felt no earthly tether, no pull of gravity. It was as if my very essence had been released from a heavy shell. And then I saw it. Below me, illuminated by some ethereal, almost clinical light, was the wreckage. The mangled Plymouth, the splintered tree, and the figures moving around it. My vision was incredibly vivid, sharper than anything I had ever experienced in my normal life. Every detail was crystalline, almost hyper-real. I could see the crushed metal, the dark stains on the upholstery, the debris scattered across the forest floor. My hearing, too, was heightened. I could pick out snippets of conversation, the crackle of a radio, the distant wail of sirens. And then I saw myself, a bloodied, crumpled form being attended to by figures in uniforms. My first reaction was a strange, detached pity. Man, that man is messed up, I remember thinking, a wave of empathy for this poor, injured stranger washing over me. But as my gaze lingered, I started to notice details. My jean jacket, a new USMC shirt I had just bought. It was an unmistakable uniform of my life, a jarring familiarity amidst the chaos. A slow, creeping realization dawned, a truth that punched me in a way physical pain never could. Hey, that's my jean jacket. Hey, that's my shirt. And then, the undeniable, chilling recognition. Wait, that's me. The revelation wasn't accompanied by fear or panic, but a profound sense of awe and an unsettling familiarity. It was as if a piece of a forgotten puzzle had clicked into place. This sensation of floating, of observing myself from outside, didn't shock me. It felt natural, like I was used to it, as if I had done this before. There was no question of how I was floating or why I didn't hurt. I simply knew what I was doing, like an inherent ability. A part of me felt utterly at home in that moment, despite the grim scene unfolding below. My mind was clearer, more alert than it had ever been. There was a clarity of thought that I just don't normally possess, an understanding that transcended my earthly self.
As I hovered, a peculiar light began to register. It wasn't the harsh glare of the sun or the artificial glow of headlights. This was unusually bright light, a presence that felt both ancient and intimately personal. For years, I would mistakenly believe it was the midday sun, but later I learned it was pre-dawn when I was found. This light felt incredibly warm and safe, enveloping me in a way that words fail to capture. It wasn't just illumination, it was a profound source of comfort and well-being. I felt like I was being hugged by unseen arms throughout this entire experience, a pervasive sense of being cherished and protected. This light radiated an incredible peace and pleasantness, a feeling of unadulterated happiness. There were no specific beings, no deceased relatives or ethereal mentors appearing before me in human form. Yet there was an unmistakable sense of presence, a pervasive awareness of something more, something profoundly knowing. I almost heard attention-getting sounds, subtle nudges in my awareness, especially when my focus began to waver. It was as if a gentle hand guided my attention, steering my thoughts.
These weren't explicit voices, but more like a direct infusion of understanding, a quiet knowing communication that bypassed spoken language. In this state of heightened awareness, bathed in that benevolent light, I began to perceive truths about myself and the universe that had been hidden from my waking consciousness. There was no panoramic life review in the traditional sense, no rapid-fire montage of past events. Instead, there was a profound understanding of self, a deep intrinsic knowledge that felt as ancient as time itself. I simply knew that I had been on that side before, prior to my birth, before my earthly journey began. It wasn't a memory that I retrieved, but a fundamental truth that I recognized, like running home for something forgotten during the workday. It felt like I had just popped in to grab an umbrella, a quick, familiar visit to a place I inherently belonged. This knowledge wasn't intellectual. It was a visceral, undeniable knowing. This understanding extended beyond myself. I felt an undeniable connection to everything, a profound sense of harmony with nature. The conflict that often existed between my human ego and the natural world simply dissolved. It was a sense of oneness, a feeling that all things were interconnected, part of a grand, harmonious design. There was no revelation about a specific God as defined by earthly religions, but rather a profound awareness of a higher power, a universal spirit that permeated all existence, a bedrock of unconditional love and unity. This felt more correct, more natural than anything I had ever been taught or believed.
The insights I gained were subtle, yet transformative. I simply knew I was safe and protected, an innate conviction that settled deep within me. There was also a peculiar awareness, almost like an unspoken rule, that I wasn't meant to gain certain knowledge while in this fleeting state, as if there were truths meant for a different realm, not for a mortal mind. It was a gentle caution, not a restriction. I didn't learn the explicit meaning of life or the purpose of suffering, but I understood the inherent rightness of existence, the underlying order that governed all things. I also knew, with a certainty that chilled me slightly even in that peaceful state, that returning to my body would hurt. It was a premonition, a foreknowledge that felt like a soldier preparing for a difficult march. I knew the pain was coming, and I accepted it, almost as if I had drilled for it. The entire experience was devoid of fear. There was only a profound sense of peace, clarity, and an undeniable understanding of a greater reality. It wasn't just a vision or a feeling. It was a direct communion with existence itself. Every detail was etched into my consciousness with an unparalleled vividness, a memory burned into my soul, clearer than any other event in my life. I was aware of the EMTs below, their voices like whispers in my mind, but my focus was entirely consumed by this newfound reality, this realm where I floated, unburdened, and truly free. This profound realization, this undeniable experience of existing outside my physical form, redefined everything I thought I knew.
One moment, I was observing the chaos with serene detachment, completely unburdened, and the next I was violently slammed back into a world of agonizing pain and suffocating gravity. The shock of re-entering my battered body was like an explosion, shattering the peace I'd found. The return was not gentle. There was no slow descent, no gradual reintegration. One moment I was floating, connected to everything, utterly at peace, a detached observer. The next, it was as if an invisible, colossal force slammed me back into my body. The impact was instantaneous and utterly brutal. It was like being hit by a freight train, a visceral, bone-jarring jolt that reverberated through every fiber of my being. The serene weightlessness was instantly replaced by an overwhelming heaviness, a crushing sensation that pinned me down. And then came the pain, a searing, all-consuming agony that ignited every nerve ending, a stark and horrifying contrast to the blissful absence of discomfort I had just experienced. It wasn't just physical pain, it was the shock of re-entry, the sudden awareness of being confined, limited, and fundamentally broken. I heard a shout, a voice somewhere in the immediate vicinity yelling, "He's back!" But the words were distant, muffled by the roaring pain in my head. My eyes fluttered open, or perhaps I just gained a distorted sense of vision. The world swam into view, a blur of faces and the insistent sounds of emergency responders. My first conscious thought, amidst the overwhelming agony, was a profound sense of disappointment. It wasn't fear, not initially, but a deep, mournful regret for the peace I had lost. I was back. Why? Why was I here, in this shattered form, when I had just been somewhere else, somewhere so much more right? My body felt alien, a heavy, unwieldy cage. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache that intensified with every beat of my heart. I tried to move, to sit up, but a fresh wave of grinding pain shot through my neck. I instinctively reached up, my hand finding something wet and sticky, blood, lots of it. I could feel the grotesque contortion of my neck, the agonizing instability. This was clearly the moment a state trooper, who had found me disoriented in the woods earlier, radioed in, "Oh my God, he's got a broken neck." The words, though I didn't fully comprehend them at the time, were accompanied by an immediate wave of nausea and lightheadedness, and then, mercifully, I passed out again. When I next regained some semblance of awareness, I was already in the ambulance, though my memory of being moved into it is hazy, likely a result of the trauma and passing out. The medics were working quickly, their voices a low murmur of technical terms I couldn't process. My body ached in places I didn't even know existed. There was a dull, persistent throbbing in my head, a sharp, unyielding pain in my neck, and a strange, deep ache in my hand. I later learned I had a head wound requiring 192 stitches, a broken C1 vertebra, the very first bone in my neck, and a broken ring finger. My left leg, though not initially painful in the way my head and neck were, felt strangely numb and disconnected.
The reactions of those around me were a mix of frantic professionalism and sheer bewilderment. My friend, who went for help, had already reached the trailers and called 911, sending responders our way. The state troopers who arrived on the scene were piecing together the chaotic puzzle. I remember them questioning my friend. "You said there were 3 when you left, these 2 and you." My friend, bless his clear head, corrected them. "No, there were 3 in the car. There's a lost Marine out there." They were bewildered. They had found 2 victims, but my initial panicked run into the woods had thrown a major wrench into their victim count. The disbelief in their voices was palpable. They couldn't fathom how someone so severely injured could just walk away, then seemingly reappear. It would be a while before I truly tried to share my experience. In the immediate aftermath, survival was the priority. Days bled into weeks in the hospital. The physical pain was paramount, a constant, undeniable reminder of my return. My neck was immobilized, my head bandaged. The sheer extent of my injuries slowly became clear, and the reality of what I had survived was overwhelming. When I did eventually try to recount fragments of the out-of-body experience, seeing myself, the feeling of floating, the peaceful light, the reactions were predictable. Doctors nodded politely, attributing it to trauma or concussion. Family members listened with concern, but a polite skepticism often tinged their responses. They were relieved I was alive, but the nuances of my subjective experience were understandably secondary to my physical recovery. It took about 5 years after the incident, learning the details of how I was found pre-dawn after running into the woods, for the full scope of my out-of-body experience to truly flood back with crystal clarity. Only then did I begin to piece together the fragments of that consciousness beyond my body. When I finally started to share it then, it was always met with a mix of fascination and a hint of doubt. People knew I believed it, that it was real to me. One friend who had recently spent 10 days in a coma was particularly inquisitive. He confirmed elements of my experience, the feeling of being on the other side, which validated my memories and made me feel less alone in what I had witnessed. The contrast between that fleeting, effortless existence and the brutal, confining reality of my physical body was a shock I would carry with me long after the wounds healed.
After witnessing what lay beyond, the mundane worries of earthly existence simply dissolved, replaced by an unshakable inner peace. I no longer feared the end, because I had already glimpsed the infinite, and it was a homecoming. The transition from the ethereal lightness of that other realm to the crushing reality of my physical body wasn't just painful, it was a profound rupture. But what followed, in the weeks, months, and years after the accident, was an even deeper, more subtle transformation. My life, on the surface, resumed its course, but internally, everything had fundamentally shifted. The young Marine who chased thrills and sought external validation was gone, replaced by someone with a quiet but unyielding clarity. My priorities dramatically reordered themselves. Before, I was driven by the typical pursuits of a young man: adventure, camaraderie, a bit of recklessness, and the structured path of the military. After the NDE, these things still held some appeal, but they no longer consumed me. The relentless pursuit of material possessions or status seemed utterly trivial. What truly mattered were genuine connections, moments of quiet contemplation, and a profound appreciation for the simple act of being. I stopped valuing superficial victories or external achievements. Instead, I gained an immense appreciation for the fragility and preciousness of every breath. My relationships became deeper. I sought out authenticity and connection, no longer tolerating superficiality. While I remained a Marine, my perspective on service and life itself broadened. It wasn't about blind duty anymore. It was about honoring the gift for existence. My understanding of life, death, and existence was irrevocably altered. Before, I was a born-again Christian by cultural upbringing, but my faith was largely academic. I believed in God, but it was a distant, abstract concept. After the NDE, my personal philosophy evolved. I moved away from rigid religious doctrines and into a more unaffiliated, secular spiritual view. I came to believe not necessarily in a specific anthropomorphic God, but in the universe and a pervasive spirit or higher power. This wasn't a rejection of spirituality, it was a deepening and personalization of it. The fear of death, which I didn't consciously realize I held before, vanished completely. How could I fear something I had already experienced, something that felt more natural, more correct than life in the physical body? I knew, with an absolute certainty, that there was an afterlife, not as a distant heaven or hell, but as a continuation of consciousness, a return to a state of being out of body that felt inherently right. My brief journey to that side, that sense of having been there before my birth, ingrained in me the understanding that our earthly lives are but a fleeting chapter in a much grander, eternal story. It felt like I had simply run home for something I forgot, a quick pop-in, rather than a final destination. I understood the concept of universal connection, or oneness, in a way I never could have intellectually grasped. The feeling of being at home in that state, connected to everything, transcended any previous notion of individuality. I no longer felt in conflict with nature or the flow of existence. There was an inherent harmony, a feeling of being an integral part of a vast, benevolent whole. This wasn't about understanding everything in a factual sense, but about gaining a profound clarity of thought, an intuitive grasp of fundamental truths about myself and the interconnectedness of all things. I didn't immediately emerge from the hospital with a grand new mission statement, but a new purpose certainly began to emerge. It wasn't about becoming a preacher or a guru, but about living with a deeper sense of authenticity and presence. My purpose became about experiencing life more fully, embracing joy, and approaching challenges with the understanding that I was safe, protected, and part of something bigger. I haven't changed my profession in a radical way, but my approach to life itself has become my mission. I've become more empathetic, more patient, and more aware of the subtle energies around me. While I haven't actively sought to spread knowledge about NDEs in a formal way, I'm always open to sharing my story, especially when it might help someone else grappling with questions of life and death. Integrating this profound experience into ordinary life wasn't without its difficulties. How do you explain floating above your own mangled body, feeling unconditional peace to someone who hasn't been there? In the initial years, I often found myself struggling to articulate what happened, met with polite skepticism or well-meaning but ultimately dismissive explanations from medical professionals. The contrast between that expansive, boundless state and the confines of my damaged physical body, the lingering pain and the slow recovery, was a constant, jarring reminder. It took time to process. For 5 years, the full scope of the NDE was fragmented, almost like a dream. It was only when I learned the precise details of my rescue, being found pre-dawn in the woods after having run so far, that the full memory flooded back with crystal clarity, becoming more real than any other event in my life. This internal video of my experience is burned into my soul, unwavering and vivid. It's a memory I can access with perfect clarity, and I've never wavered from its reality. My near-death experience wasn't a dream, a hallucination, or a trick of the mind. It was a tangible, undeniable reality that shattered the illusion of separateness and the fear of the unknown. It showed me that consciousness continues beyond the physical body, that there is an inherent harmony in the universe, and that we are all deeply interconnected. The pain of returning was real, but the peace and understanding I gained from the other side were infinitely more profound. If there's one message I want to leave you with, it's this: don't fear death. It's not an end, but a transition. And in that transition, there is a profound sense of peace and a homecoming that feels more natural than anything you've ever known on this side. Live your life fully. Embrace genuine connections, and remember that you are part of something vast and beautiful. The truth, in my experience, is far more comforting and awe-inspiring than we could ever imagine.